There is a moment in every operation, and I've been in enough of them to tell you this with absolute certainty, where the mission and the men executing it stand at the same crossroads. One path leads to survival, the other leads to success. And the brutal truth of war is that sometimes you cannot have both. What happened near Luhansk in the early hours of that morning was not simply a drone strike. It was a masterclass in decision-making under fire, in leadership under annihilation, in the kind of disciplined courage that doesn't come from training alone. It comes from a deeper conviction that the mission is worth more than the man. Stay with me through this, because what unfolded in those minutes above the Ukrainian steppe will challenge every assumption you have about modern warfare, about technology, about what it truly means to hold the line when everything around you is collapsing. At 06:23 local time, 36 Ukrainian FPV drones lifted almost simultaneously from a concealed launch zone and accelerated toward a Russian oil train. 80 miles per hour. Precision, aggression, months of planning condensed into seconds of action. I've commanded special operations forces. I've watched men move into darkness with nothing but their training and their trust in each other. And I can tell you, the moment you commit to an operation, the moment those boots hit the ground or those rotors begin to spin, everything changes. The plan is no longer theory. It is physics. It is flesh. It is consequence. And in Luhansk that morning, consequence arrived before the drones even crossed the perimeter wire. The instant those 36 FPVs powered up and broke from their racks, Russian sensors did exactly what they were built to do. Heat signatures, movement patterns, electromagnetic disturbance. The darkness that had protected the launch zone evaporated in seconds. Russia's S-19 Meta artillery systems had already identified the position. The first 152mm shell landed close enough to shake the bunker lid over the Ukrainian operators' heads. Think about that for a moment. These men are not soldiers charging a hill. They are operators, controllers, sitting in a buried shelter with screens in front of them and the weight of a 36-drone swarm in their hands. And now, the earth itself is being thrown at them. What they did next will define this entire story. They did not stop. They did the math, quickly, cleanly, the way trained operators do when panic is a luxury they cannot afford. The drones needed roughly 10 minutes to reach the train. Russian artillery needed only a few minutes more to correct their coordinates and begin systematically destroying the bunker network. That gap, that narrow corridor of time between what the enemy was doing and what the mission still required, that gap was the battlefield, and the Ukrainians owned it. They chose to continue. That decision, made in a shaking bunker under incoming fire, is the kind of decision that historians write about and commanders spend careers trying to cultivate in their people. It is the decision to serve something larger than your own survival. Now, here is where the operation reveals its true architecture and where you begin to understand that what looked like a drone strike was actually something far more sophisticated. As the swarm pushed toward its target, a Russian BTR-22 armored vehicle detected the incoming formation and opened fire. Tracer rounds cut across the morning sky like orange wire. But the Ukrainian operators had anticipated exactly this reaction. The swarm split, instantly, precisely, into 4 separate elements. One group climbed, one dropped low, one broke left, one broke right. The machine gun rounds tore through the airspace the drones had occupied half a second earlier. Empty sky. The enemy was shooting at ghosts. And here is what the Russian crew could not see, what made this engagement fundamentally different from anything their doctrine had fully prepared them for. Each of those FPV drones was trailing a fiber optic cable, thinner than a fishing line, nearly invisible against the pre-dawn sky. But that cable carried something Russian jamming equipment, even at maximum power, could not touch. Control signals and video data traveling as pulses of light through glass. No radio frequency to intercept, no electromagnetic signature to overwhelm. The most expensive electronic warfare systems Russia could deploy were, in that moment, pointing at the wrong problem entirely. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between technology and human will on a modern battlefield. Beneath the swarm, Russian EW systems flooded the spectrum with interference. Millions of dollars worth of jamming equipment doing exactly what it was designed to do and doing it well. But the Fiberlink drones were not listening. They flew through that wall of electronic noise the way a submarine moves through a storm on the surface. Untouched, steady, indifferent. The operators back at the launch site watched their screens with the kind of focused calm that only comes from preparation, from having rehearsed the failure modes, from knowing, not hoping, knowing that the architecture of their system had been built to survive exactly this kind of assault. Russian artillery, meanwhile, had not given up on the operators. It refined its targeting. The second shell landed closer than the first. And this is where the Ukrainian preparation revealed its second layer. The control network was not housed in a single bunker. It was distributed across 4 shelters connected by trenches, spaced deliberately far enough apart that one artillery impact could not eliminate the entire command capability in a single blow. These were not technicians sitting in a basement improvising. These were military professionals who had studied the problem, modeled the threat, and engineered redundancy into every phase of the operation. Leadership is not always visible in the man who stands at the front. Sometimes it lives in the mind that designed the trench network 3 weeks before the mission launched. Then the third shell changed everything. When it struck, fragments tore through the air and severed several fiber optic cables. 3 drones lost their protected link and shifted immediately to backup radio control. Still flying, still functional, but now exposed, fully exposed, to the weight of Russian electronic warfare bearing down on the frequency bands. The jamming was working, partially. 3 drones were compromised, but 27 were still flying with clean fiber connections and stable feeds. And inside those shelters, operators were doing something that separates the trained professional from the merely brave. They were making disciplined decisions under compounding pressure. The call was made. Continue the mission. Begin withdrawing through the trench network simultaneously. Do not abandon the swarm. Do not stay still long enough to be destroyed. Move. They gathered their equipment and moved. Seconds later, another shell slammed down meters from the bunker they had just vacated. Meters. If they had hesitated, if doubt had slowed them by even 5 seconds, the control team would have been eliminated. The mission would have died with them in that shelter. Instead, they were already racing north through the trench system toward the reserve position. That is not luck. That is planning. That is the physical manifestation of a commander who understood that in this kind of warfare, the human node in the network is as much a target as the machine. But if you think that was the hardest part, if you think surviving the artillery and keeping the swarm airborne was the peak of what these men faced, you are not yet ready for what was coming. Because the train was still moving, and what that meant for the mathematics of interception was about to force an entirely new set of decisions on operators who were already running on the edge of their contingency margins. The leading drones were bringing the target into view. Through the forward camera feeds, the Ukrainian operators could see the oil train at the Luhansk fuel depot, black smoke rising from the diesel engine, tank cars sitting in the open, exposed with minimal structural protection. Ukraine had watched this route for weeks. They had studied the timing windows, the patrol patterns, the defensive positions. They believed 90 seconds at precisely the right moment could define the entire operation. But targets do not cooperate with timelines. Somewhere in the depot, a Russian operator received a warning. The driver pushed forward. The heavy oil train began to roll. 11 miles per hour became 16. 16 became 20. 20 approached 25, near the limit for a fully loaded train on aging track. And with every mile per hour of speed, the interception geometry shifted. The point where the drones needed to arrive was no longer where it had been calculated to be. The operators had to recalculate, continuously, under pressure, with diminishing battery reserves and the remnants of a jamming field still working to degrade the less protected elements of their formation. The mission was not falling apart, but it was evolving, rapidly, brutally, into something that required a different kind of skill than the one that launched 36 drones at dawn. Near the railway crossing, a Russian Krasuka-4 electronic warfare system detected abnormal electromagnetic activity and powered up hard. Its antenna array oriented toward the approaching swarm and began pouring jamming energy across every frequency band standard drones depend on. The goal was simple and decisive: smother the control links, collapse the video feeds, blind the operators, and stop the strike before it reached the depot. For the drones already running on backup radio control, the effect was immediate and severe. Feeds stuttered, images broke into fragments of noise. Some froze completely, then dissolved into static. A few drones held their last commanded course. Others began to wander as stable input disappeared beneath the interference. But the fiber-linked drones kept moving, straight, steady, indifferent to the electromagnetic storm surrounding them. And inside the Russian control cabin, the operators saw something that had no good answer. The jamming was working, and it wasn't working. Some of the formation was degraded. Most of it wasn't. The power increased. More spectrum was saturated. More radio-controlled drones lost coherence. And still, the swarm advanced. Then the deeper consequence of maximum jamming output emerged, the one that Russian doctrine had perhaps not fully modeled. The jamming did not only hurt the Ukrainians, it disrupted Russian communications across the defensive zone. A BTR-22 crew saw the drones closing and tried to warn a Pantsir unit positioned farther away. All they received in return was static. In attempting to blind the enemy, the Russian defensive network had partially blinded itself. 9 drones were in disorder, 27 were still flying clean, and the train, the target, was still on the track. This is the nature of modern warfare that no headquarters briefing fully captures until you are inside it. Technology is never simply an advantage. It is a system with edges, with failure modes, with second and third order effects that only reveal themselves under the stress of actual combat. The Ukrainian operators understood this. They had built their system around it. The Russians were learning it in real time, at a cost they could not yet fully calculate. And what happened next, at checkpoint 3, and then beyond it, would bring the entire operation to its most brutal and decisive phase, because the Pantsir was waiting, and it was about to prove that even the best designed swarm can bleed. At checkpoint 3, the BTR-22 crew had one chance: a single firing window, roughly 10 seconds as the swarm crossed their position at high speed and constant evasion. I want you to understand what 10 seconds means in combat. It is not a pause. It is not a breath. It is a heartbeat stretched to its absolute limit. And inside that heartbeat, a gunner has to acquire, lead, track, and fire against targets that are not flying like machines. They are flying like living things. One drone climbed, one dropped, one cut left, another snapped right without warning. Burst after burst from the armored vehicle's gun tore through airspace the drones had occupied a fraction of a second before. Empty air every time. The commander kept demanding support on the radio. The radio kept returning static. The jamming that was supposed to protect the position was consuming it from the inside. And the swarm kept moving north, toward the depot, toward the train, toward the moment that everything in this operation had been built around. Then the Pantsir S-1 entered the engagement. And here is where I need you to pay close attention, because this is where the battle stops being a story about drones and becomes a story about decision-making under irreversible conditions. The Pantsir surveillance radar acquired the swarm through one of the most cluttered electromagnetic and visual environments imaginable. Rail infrastructure, metal poles, warehouses, thermal noise from the depot, trees and terrain, and the residual smoke from artillery impacts. Its fire control system began tracking. The operator did not wait for a clean solution. He fired 8 missiles in rapid succession. The first salvo hit hard and fast. 7 drones were destroyed almost simultaneously, ripped from the formation in mid-flight. 7 in seconds. For a moment, it looked like the Russian air defense was going to solve the problem by sheer lethality. But one drone slipped through. One FPV dropped low enough, fast enough, at the precise angle that put it below the kill zone and against the terrain background where the radar struggled to maintain clean separation. One drone survived the salvo, and the Ukrainian operator controlling it immediately understood what that survival meant. Not victory, but adaptation. If the remaining formations stayed concentrated, the Pantsir would continue removing them in batches. The geometry of concentrated swarm flight was a gift to a system designed to engage multiple targets in sequence. So the order changed instantly. Spread the formation, drop lower, use the depot infrastructure, the rail lines, the warehouses, every structure in the area as background clutter that degrades the radar picture and forces the fire control system into ambiguity. This forced the Pantsir crew into a dilemma that no amount of technical superiority could resolve cleanly. Missiles fired into the depot's own infrastructure risked destroying the very facilities the defensive position existed to protect. The calculus of air defense shifted in seconds from offensive interception to constrained engagement. And constrained engagement against a swarm that was actively exploiting the constraint is a fundamentally weaker position. The Pantsir shifted to guns. Twin 30mm cannons opened up and built a wall of fire across the approach corridor. 4 more drones were destroyed, ripped apart by high-velocity cannon rounds. The Ukrainians adapted again, immediately, without hesitation. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between sacrifice and strategy in modern combat. The remaining drones split into deliberate roles. One group climbed, making themselves visible, presenting as the more obvious threat. Another group stayed low and accelerated forward. Others broke laterally to distort the aiming geometry and force the fire control system to choose between multiple simultaneous engagements. The Pantsir's radar favored the higher group. They were easier to track, easier to separate from the background, easier to engage with confidence. So the fire followed them. And while it did, the low group, the quiet group, the group that had accepted the role of moving unseen while their counterparts drew fire, continued skimming toward the railway line at near maximum speed. The gunner realized the error, but realization in combat is only useful if it arrives before the moment passes. It did not. The low group had already slipped beyond the optimal firing angle. The window had closed, and they were still flying. 4 Strela 10 air defense vehicles entered from a separate observation area and attempted to close the gap. One locked onto a leading drone with its infrared seeker and fired. The target disappeared in a flash above the tracks. But the Strela crews ran almost immediately into a problem of pure geometry, the kind of problem that exists before the first shot fires, embedded in the physics of the engagement itself. The drones were crossing nearly perpendicular to the vehicle's line of sight. Each one remained inside the viable aiming window for less than a second. The crews had to rotate, reacquire, distinguish the drone's heat signature from the thermal noise of rails, engine parts, and burning structures, and fire, all before the target vanished again. The math was not in their favor. Most engagements were late before they began, and the swarm, diminished but not broken, continued its approach. Now here is where leadership, real leadership, the kind forged under pressure rather than described in doctrine, becomes the decisive variable. Because at this moment, new warnings were flashing across Ukrainian control screens. Battery levels had dropped sharply. Constant course corrections, low-altitude evasive flight, and the sustained engagement with multiple defensive systems had drained power faster than any pre-mission calculation had projected. Some drones had only seconds of stable flight remaining. This is the moment that separates a commander from a controller. A controller manages what exists. A commander reshapes the mission around what remains. The Ukrainian operators made a final and irreversible tactical decision, and it was the right one. Instead of continuing to chase the moving train directly, they would strike the track ahead of it, force an emergency stop, fix the target in place. 6 FPVs carrying explosively formed penetrator warheads broke forward from the swarm and dove toward a section of rail approximately 1 mile in front of the locomotive. I want you to understand what this decision required. It required accepting that the original mission profile, direct engagement with the train, was no longer achievable with the resources remaining. It required the intellectual honesty to abandon a plan that was no longer serving the objective and replace it with one that could. In my experience commanding at every level, from platoon to theater, that capacity to release the plan while holding the mission is among the rarest and most valuable qualities a leader can possess. The detonations hammered the rail line in near simultaneous impacts. Steel warped, joints tore loose, ballast erupted into the air. In the span of seconds, what had been functioning track became a twisted obstacle field, impassable for any heavy train moving at any speed. And behind that point of destruction, the Panzer cannons were still firing. But prolonged continuous fire creates its own physical limit. Heat builds in the barrels, accuracy degrades. A pause becomes necessary before mechanical damage to the weapon system becomes the next tactical problem. On a quiet range, that pause is a maintenance note. On this battlefield, it was a gap, brief, unpredictable, and real. 9 remaining FPVs pushed through that opening, flying low, moving through smoke and dust rising from the shattered rails. The destroyed track had accomplished exactly what the operators needed it to. Ahead of the strike point, the train's engineer heard the explosions and applied emergency braking. Steel wheels screamed against steel rail. The entire column shuddered, lurched, and came to a halt, stopped just short of the destroyed section, exactly where Ukraine needed it. No longer moving, no longer able to escape by speed or distance, fixed in place, loaded with fuel, structurally intact, and completely exposed. But if you believe the mission was won in that moment, if you think stopping the train meant the battle was over, then you have not yet understood the nature of what these operators were facing. Because what came next was not a clean strike against a stationary target. It was a final gauntlet, executed with nearly spent drones against defenders who were now fighting with the focused desperation of men who understood what failure meant for their position. The fiber optic cables trailing behind the surviving drones had stretched to near their maximum operational range. One by one, the release mechanisms detached the lines, clean, deliberate, by design, so they would not snag the drones or drag them backward in the final approach. From that moment forward, the surviving FPVs were no longer shielded from electronic interference. They shifted into final control mode with almost no battery margin remaining. But at this distance, the protection they had lost mattered less than the ground they had gained. They were close enough that no amount of jamming could reshape the outcome. The geometry had already decided it. Russian defenders made one final emergency move. A KAMAZ 6350 truck pulled up beside the stopped train and unloaded soldiers carrying AK-12 rifles. They spread along the tank cars and opened fire. High volume, sustained, desperate, hoping the sheer density of small arms fire could accomplish what missiles, cannons, and electronic warfare had collectively failed to finish. I've seen this before, not with drones, but with the fundamental dynamic it represents. When a defensive line has exhausted its primary systems and falls back to rifles against a threat that has already absorbed everything else, that is not a tactical adjustment. That is a final stand. And final stands, however courageous, are decided by physics and momentum more than by will. The conditions did not favor the rifles. Against small, fast-moving targets executing continuous evasive maneuvers at low altitude, each soldier had less than a second of viable engagement window. Every micro-correction by an FPV was enough to throw a burst wide. One drone slipped left along the track bed. Another dropped and snapped upward through smoke from the ruined rails. A third cut across the haze at an angle that presented no clean aspect to any shooter on the line. The leading drone was finally hit. It crashed beside the track. But the swarm's logic had already accounted for attrition. Another drone immediately reassigned itself, not toward the train, but toward the truck, toward the platform from which the rifle fire was being sustained. The impact triggered a fireball beside the Russian firing line. Black smoke surged upward. Blast pressure and fragments tore the defensive formation apart. Soldiers scattered for cover. For a few seconds, just a few, the suppressive fire stopped. That gap was enough. The remaining FPVs surged through smoke, dirt, and flame, staying close to the center line of the railway, using the chaos of the truck strike as both cover and concealment. Russian troops were still shooting, but now they were shooting into confusion. Targets disappeared in the haze and reappeared much closer than expected. By the time the defenders recognized how near the drones had actually come, reaction time was gone. The first FPV cut its motor just before impact. At that speed, it no longer needed thrust. It had become a small, guided projectile, sliding through the final yards on nothing but physics and momentum. And in that silence, in that brief, terrible silence between the engine cutting and the impact, the mission reached its conclusion. The strikes were deliberate and precise. The first hit near the coupling assembly between the locomotive and the front tank car, tearing the connection loose and jolting the lead section violently. The second struck the fuel valve cluster. Metal gave way. Diesel sprayed under pressure and found the heat from the prior impact. The third hit the braking and wheel assembly, adding mechanical shock and sparks beneath the train. A fourth drone struck a leaking tank car where vapor had already gathered around the steel body in the seconds since the initial strikes. And at that point, at that specific, cascading, irreversible point, the train began to participate in its own destruction. Fuel mist burns fast. Heat moves faster than defenders can reposition. Pressure builds inside damaged tanks at a rate that safety systems are designed to manage under normal conditions, not under simultaneous structural failure, valve rupture, and external ignition. One explosion fed the thermal and pressure conditions required for the next. The defenders were still attempting to respond, but the battle had already crossed into a different physics. It was no longer about intercepting drones in the air. It was about whether the train's own cargo, structure, and accumulated mechanical stress would complete what the operators had set in motion. And the answer, announced in fire and black smoke rising over the Luhansk fuel depot, was yes. A powerful secondary explosion tore through the center of the formation. Shockwaves bent steel and threw fragments outward from the rail line. Flames climbed above the depot skyline. Thick black smoke rolled upward and spread. Cars near the center of the fire were ripped from the tracks. Some tipped. Others collided with adjacent cars under the force of the blast sequence. What had been a functioning Russian supply train, loaded with fuel, moving under escort, protected by layered air defense, covered by artillery and electronic warfare, had become a burning strip of twisted metal and ruptured tanks stretching across the rail yard. And here is what I want you to carry with you from this. Not the spectacle, not the fire, not the tactical detail of fiber optics and missile engagements and trench networks. Carry this. Ukraine was not trying to produce dramatic destruction. The objective was never the image. The objective was the system that image represented. Fuel is not cargo. Fuel is mobility. It moves tanks and artillery and logistics trucks and the generators that keep.